I was recently looking through the speaker list for a high-profile symposium on the origins of complexity. There was one name that stood out, a retired physicist from an ivy-covered university that people usually mention in hushed, reverent tones. When he finally walked onto the stage, he looked exactly like a movie director's dream of a great thinker. The tweed jacket, the shock of silver hair, and that calm, authoritative posture that silently signals, "I have seen the fundamental truths of the universe." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. But as he began to speak, he wasn't presenting data on subatomic particles or new findings in thermodynamics. Instead, he started weaving a narrative about signs of design and metaphysical purpose. He was essentially delivering a sermon on intelligent design, using the same logic you might hear at a back alley tent revival. Yet because he was standing behind a mahogany podium in a prestigious lecture hall, the audience didn't scoff. They leaned in. They took notes. They treated his theological guesswork as if it were a peer-reviewed breakthrough. Now you contrast that with a random crank on the internet, someone arguing that the Earth is flat or that the moon is made of plasma. That person gets mocked, debunked, and ignored within seconds. They are a joke. But our emeritus professor, he gets a standing ovation, a lucrative book deal, and a front row seat in the national culture wars. Watching this play out, I felt a strange sense of cognitive dissonance. It was as if the title Emeritus acted like a magical epistemic shield, rendering him immune to the very rules of evidence and rigor that earned him the title in the first place. It makes you wonder, why are we so terrified of being impolite to a man in a lab coat who has clearly abandoned the scientific method? Why does the scientific community have such a massive blind spot for nonsense, as long as it's wrapped in a prestigious resume and a bit of religious branding? It suggests that in the world of high-level academia, social status doesn't just support the science. It often outlives it.
And what you've hit on there is the absolute core of the conflict we're diving into today. When? When exactly does a credential stop signifying intellectual rigor and start signifying, institutional immunity? That's the central challenge. We're looking at a systemic failure, one that allows social status, whether it's a Nobel Prize, a top professorship, or just that honorific emeritus, to completely bypass the scientific method. This erosion, it really undermines the ideal of meritocracy. But I think, maybe more dangerously, it just deeply damages public trust in the whole concept of expertise. So today, we're going to unpack precisely how this emeritus shield functions, why it's so difficult for academia to police its own celebrities, and look at the systemic flaws, from peer review to, the financial incentives that reward conformity over inquiry.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting right at the top, the apex of authority. We're calling this the Emeritus Shield. You and I have talked about how this title, which is really meant to be an honor, something for a dignified retirement, gets weaponized in public. It provides what the source material calls epistemic immunity.
That is the perfect term for it. The issue isn't that retired people have opinions. Of course they do. That's their right. The problem is the public perception, the social status, the prestige of the institution, the weight of that title. It just dramatically outlives the actual scientific rigor. To the public, that title signals ultimate authority. But to a working scientist, it often just means that person hasn't produced verifiable, peer-reviewed research in maybe a decade. Or more.
And the double standard is just blinding when you look at it. A young scientist, maybe tenure track, who promotes a challenging idea, they will face relentless, often brutal criticism from their peers.
Oh, absolutely.
But if an emeritus professor from an Ivy League school promotes something that's demonstrably unscientific, like intelligent design, suddenly they get book deals, media slots, standing ovations. The prestige is a bubble protecting the lack of evidence.
That's right. And we see this betrayal of meritocracy play out so clearly in academic life. Think about the situation of a young doctoral candidate, let's call her Maya. She spends 4 years in meticulous labor, running thousands of experiments, testing the very limits of evolutionary biology. Every single decimal point, every conclusion is intensely scrutinized. She had to fight for every comma in her publications.
She's held to the absolute highest standard of rigor. She has to constantly defend her methods.
Exactly. Now, you compare that to Professor Emeritus Sterling, a man whose name is literally tied to the reputation of that Ivy League institution. He's a legend, and the university benefits hugely from his past work.
And what's Sterling doing with that pedigree?
He's using his title on talk shows at these big non-scientific conferences to promote intelligent design. He's presenting complex biology as irrefutable proof of a cosmic architect. It's theology dressed up as physics. And he's not publishing in Nature or Science. He's publishing in mass market books for a non-scientific audience. Meanwhile, Maya is fighting to defend every data point, and she watches Sterling, who hasn't faced serious peer review in 20 years, being celebrated as a sage. The perception is just. It's damning. The institution isn't upholding the scientific method. It's protecting a brand. This is really the systemic failure of academic meritocracy in action. You see the emeritus status functioning as a shield for pseudoscience, and it highlights this broader institutional betrayal where that credentialed status is prioritized over the rigorous application of the scientific method. It suggests that once you hit legend status, the rules of evidence just stop applying, at least in public.
It's the ultimate intellectual immunity card. And this doesn't just damage the internal culture, it has a direct and immediate human cost. Which brings us to the second story here, the one about the collapse of trust. The public just assumes that prestigious title means continuous current rigor.
They do, and that assumption can be dangerous. It moves this from an abstract debate to, tangible risk. There's this sobering story of a father named David. His daughter was facing a serious illness. He's desperate, and he finds articles from a retired, world-renowned neuroscientist, a professor with that emeritus badge from a top university. And this professor is promoting vibrational energy pseudoscience as a replacement for standard evidence-based therapy. David explicitly said he trusted the credential that was the badge of authority for him, much more than some random website.
So he didn't trust the claim itself, he trusted the institution that stamped the man's name.
That is the critical distinction.
Yes.
He delegated his judgment to the university's prestige, and of course, the vibrational energy therapy, it didn't work. His daughter's condition got worse. David felt this profound sense of betrayal, and when he went to the institution looking for some accountability, he was met with what he called a polite bureaucratic shrug.
What was the university's official line on this? On their famous emeritus promoting dangerous nonsense?
They claimed he was independent now, that his activities weren't their responsibility, they just washed their hands of it. But here's the hypocrisy. They were still featuring him on their distinguished faculty page. They were using his career statistics for fundraising. The university wanted the prestige, that silhouette of the great man, to attract money, but they didn't want the liability that came with the dangerous, non-scientific opinions he was actively selling. So the moment he crossed the line into verifiable harm, they used the emeritus status to distance themselves legally, while still profiting from his name. That is a profound moral abdication. It absolutely is. And for David, the realization was that the hierarchy cared far more about maintaining the dignity, the prestigious silhouette of its legends, than it did about protecting the public from the pseudoscience those men were selling using the university's authority. And investigating how that emeritus shield contributes to the collapse of public trust, well, it's critical. It creates this social hierarchy where status-based authority is just permitted to bypass the empirical scrutiny that's required of everyone else, and this collapse of public trust is a direct reaction to that.
The institution protects the silhouette, not the science. And this problem, high status leading to terrible ideas. It's not just limited to the emeritus class, it affects the biggest, most active names in science. Which brings us to the Nobel disease.
The Nobel disease is, unfortunately, a very well-documented phenomenon. It describes the tendency for people who get the highest honors, like the Nobel, to adopt unfounded and often pseudoscientific beliefs outside their own field. The psychological shift is often driven by a cocktail of things: extreme self-confidence, confusing intuition with evidence, and creating an echo chamber where they just aren't criticized anymore. A lifetime of yes men.
It's like winning the Nobel gives you an immediate license to be an authority on everything, from biochemistry to cosmology, without doing the work.
Exactly. And the examples they're truly wild, especially when you consider the brilliance it took to win the prize in the first place.
Let's get into some of those. I think the story of Kary Mullis is probably the most shocking.
Mullis won the Nobel in '93 in chemistry for developing PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. This technology is it's foundational. It lets scientists amplify DNA, it transformed molecular biology, diagnostics, forensics, everything. The man was a verified genius in his domain.
A transformative technology.
Yeah.
And yet, his beliefs outside of that specific domain were, to put it mildly, less grounded.
Far less grounded. Mullis became a very visible figure who denied that HIV causes AIDS. He also expressed doubt about human-caused climate change. But it gets much stranger. In his own autobiography, he professed a belief in astrology, claimed LSD helped him develop PCR, and recounted a truly bizarre personal encounter.
Wait, I remember this. A fluorescent talking raccoon. I have to stop you there. It's hard to reconcile PCR, one of the cornerstones of modern biology, with talking space raccoons. How do you hold those two ideas in your head at once?
It just illustrates the extreme divergence that could happen when brilliance leaves its lane. Mullis described meeting this fluorescent talking raccoon, and he suggested it might have been an extraterrestrial alien. That level of departure from empirical rigor, it just shows the deep psychological mechanism at play. It's the arrogance that comes with massive validated success.
And he's not the only one. Linus Pauling, a true giant of science, also fell into this.
Linus Pauling was a two-time Nobel laureate. Chemistry and peace, an almost unheard of achievement. But later in life, he became famous for promoting huge doses of vitamin C as a cure-all, for everything from the common cold to cancer. He even suggested massive doses of niacin could cure schizophrenia. And while he meant well, the rigorous double-blind trials just didn't support his claims. But he promoted them fiercely, based purely on his own authority.
And then there's William Shockley, co-inventor of the transistor.
Shockley, a pioneer in physics, became a prominent and highly controversial proponent of eugenics later in his career, advocating deeply flawed and discriminatory theories about race and intelligence. The common thread here, Mullis, Pauling, Shockley, is this psychological mechanism. Expertise is domain-specific. When a person who achieved monumental success in one area, like physics, ventures into these other complex fields like medicine or political ideology, that rigor often just evaporates. They fall into the trap of confusing their strong intuition, which served them so well in their narrow field, with actual empirical evidence, especially when they're no longer subjected to the aggressive scrutiny that made them successful in the first place.
So if you're celebrated enough, you stop listening to the checks and balances that made you successful. You're too big to fail, or at least too famous to be effectively corrected. Which leads us perfectly into part 2, and how institutions handle critique, especially when status is involved. So what's the fundamental difference between a scientist who is, say, aggressively wrong about a specific hypothesis and a framework that is structurally unscientific?
This is an incredibly important distinction, one that gets muddled all the time in public discussions. Science progresses through error. Being wrong is part of the process. Being structurally unscientific, though, that's abandoning the process entirely.
Let's use that comparison of Avi Loeb, the Harvard professor with a theory about extraterrestrial artifacts. He's highly controversial. Many of his peers think he's wrong. But why is his work still considered science while intelligent design is not?
It's all about the methodology. Loeb operates entirely within a scientific framework. He makes an extraordinary claim that Oumuamua might be alien tech, but he proposes a hypothesis, he uses available data, and critically, his claims are falsifiable. He actively engages with his peers even when they push back hard. His ideas are contested where they should be, in journals, at conferences, through counter-evidence.
So he's controversial, maybe speculative, but he's still playing by the rules of the game. He's putting something out there that can be tested and proven false.
That is the key metric. Now, you contrast that with intelligent design, or ID. ID doesn't start with a testable hypothesis. It starts with a theological conclusion, the existence of a cosmic architect, and then it retrofits evidence to support that pre-existing conclusion.
It's teleology, not science. The conclusion is fixed before you even start.
Exactly. It is, by definition, an ideology dressed up as a hypothesis. And its primary goal isn't scientific validation. ID is rejected by the mainstream scientific community, not because of some religious intolerance, but because it is structurally unscientific. It produces no testable predictions. How do you falsify the existence of a designer? It lacks a research program aimed at peer review, and it functions mainly as a rhetorical and political tool for school boards and lobbying groups. It's rejected due to a fundamental lack of quality control, not a lack of piety. That's the difference between being possibly wrong and being structurally unscientific.
And the scientific community knows this distinction. But when these structurally unscientific claims get wrapped in religious clothing and promoted by high-status people, the community often defaults to what you call polite silence.
And that is the high cost of institutional timidity. It's a form of moral cowardice when it comes to defending the scientific method itself. Institutions are terrified of appearing intolerant of religious diversity, which makes any direct, aggressive attack on this kind of pseudoscience feel impolite or politically incorrect. This fear creates a bizarre and deeply uneven playing field.
How uneven are we talking?
We're talking about a massive disparity. Think about it. Anti-vaxxers, extreme climate skeptics, flat earthers, they're all subjected to harsh, rigorous, and immediate debunking. But ID proponents, especially those with powerful emeritus titles who use academic language, are often treated with kid gloves. The critique is softer, slower, because their claims are sacred to millions, and the university doesn't want the political firestorm that comes with being seen as anti-religion.
So the prestige and the social sensitivity act as a force field, a shield against the same rigor that's applied to every other form of pseudoscience. And the source material is clear. Politeness is not a virtue in science. Rigor is. But the institutions seem to value that social politeness over the process itself.
And this failure leads directly to profound internal hypocrisy, which is highlighted perfectly in the story from a faculty lounge at a major university, a classic tale of the hierarchy of convenience.
Let's get into that. The contrast between the junior staff and the legend. It paints a picture of intense gatekeeping for the powerless, but absolute freedom for the powerful.
Precisely. The source material details how junior staff, those fighting for their academic lives, face these intense ideological audits. Their syllabi have to conform exactly to the latest administrative trends, ensuring adherence to institutional ideals, often around diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are intensely scrutinized, policed, really.
Held to a strict line of administrative and political conformity.
Yes. But right next door, the story goes, the most senior emeritus professor is granted total intellectual anarchy. He is free to say or publish whatever he likes, no matter how unscientific. His status makes him untouchable.
Total intellectual anarchy. What did that look like in this case?
In this specific example, the professor was hosting a highly visible seminar series that openly blended theology with fundamental physics, making claims that violated the foundational principles of the scientific method. This was happening inside the institution, and the administration's response to concerns from junior faculty: polite silence. They were terrified of the bad optics of being seen to censure a legend.
So you have this absurdity of an institution aggressively policing a young lecturer's syllabus for political conformity, while simultaneously nodding politely when a famous retired professor pushes literal religious pseudoscience. They're dismantling traditional meritocratic standards for the people just starting out, while granting absolute anarchy to the powerful who are promoting unscientific idea.
And a critical analysis of these double standards in Western academic gatekeeping really shows this pattern. The institutions maintain a polite silence toward the theologized pseudoscience from eminent professors, while at the same time dismantling traditional meritocratic standards through ideological conformity for everyone else. It creates what's described as a hierarchy of convenience. Meritocratic standards are aggressively enforced for the powerless, often demanding political loyalty statements, while intellectual anarchy is granted to the powerful. The gatekeepers have essentially stopped guarding the truth and have started guarding their own social standing and institutional reputation.
That structural failure brings us neatly into part 3. The flaws in the actual mechanisms we rely on to validate scientific truth, starting with peer review itself. The system is clearly vulnerable, and few things expose that vulnerability, like the intentional hoax known as the Grievance Studies affair.
The Grievance Studies affair from 2017-2018 was, well, it was a very controversial and impactful project. The goal of the researchers, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, was to highlight what they saw as poor scholarship and eroding intellectual rigor in certain academic fields, specifically fields focused on critical social theory.
And their method was simple, if ethically questionable. Submit deliberately absurd papers to peer-reviewed journals to see what would actually get accepted.
That's correct. They wrote 20 bogus papers. They were designed to promote deliberately absurd or even morally questionable ideas, to test the limits of what these journals would accept if the conclusions just aligned with a certain ideological narrative.
Can you give us a few examples of how absurd we're talking?
Certainly. One paper argued that dogs participate in rape culture, analyzing canine behavior through a lens of sexual violence. Another suggested men could reduce their transphobia by anally penetrating themselves with sex toys. And maybe the most provocative was a paper that was essentially a chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, rewritten using modern critical academic jargon, just to see if the underlying totalitarianism would be overlooked if it was in the right academic voice.
That's an astonishing level of provocation. What was the final result of their experiment?
Well, by the time the hoax was revealed, 4 of the 20 papers had been fully published in peer-reviewed journals, 3 more had been formally accepted, and the other 7 were still in various stages of the review process.
So an acceptance rate approaching 35% for papers that were intentionally absurd, often contradictory, and in one case based on Mein Kampf.
What did the authors claim this proved? The authors, who identified as left-wing liberal skeptics, claimed it exposed a widespread systemic flaw. They argued that, quote, a culture has developed in which only certain conclusions are allowed. and put social grievances ahead of objective truth. Their central thesis was that certain fields were actively rejecting traditional standards of science and reason.
And as you'd expect, that ignited a fiercely polarized debate. Was the critique of the hoax itself any more rigorous?
Not really. The reception was binary. On one side, you had academics praising them for exposing what they saw as real flaws. On the other side, critics fiercely condemned the ethics and methodology of the hoax itself. They argued it was unethical, that it lacked a proper scientific control group, and that bad peer review can be found across all of academia, not just in the fields they targeted. One classicist called them fraudulent hit pieces.
So even the attempt to expose a flaw was immediately mired in a debate over its own methodology. It shows how fractured the system is, which suggests the problems aren't just human error. They run through the very tools we use to judge merit. Which brings us to the algorithmic failure in peer review, the evidence that LLMs inherit and reinforce our biases.
This is a worrying sign. As we integrate AI into academic processes, we risk automating and amplifying our existing biases. The audit we're discussing used GPT-4 Mini to simulate the peer review process, specifically to test if these models reproduce the identity-linked biases we already know plague human decision-making.
How was the audit structured to isolate that bias?
It was meticulous. Researchers submitted identical, high-quality manuscripts across different fields. These were then paired with synthetic author profiles, where things like institutional prestige, gender, and race were randomized. The key variable was whether the reviewer, the LLM, was blinded or not.
And what did they find when they compared anonymous review to a review where the author's affiliation was known?
This gave them their first big finding, the non-blind penalty. When author identities were revealed, the LLM's rejection recommendation dropped significantly by about 25%. And this was from a 6.7% baseline rejection rate. Since the papers were identical, the quality score assigned by the LLM barely moved, so the big drop in rejection, with almost no change in perceived quality, strongly suggested that status cues were at play.
So the moment the LLM saw Harvard or MIT, it was more likely to give the paper a pass, even though the quality score was the same. It's a gut reaction based on status, not a technical review. It's mirroring the worst of human behavior.
That's the implication. And it continued with the second finding, the institutional prestige penalty.
And the data says yes, right?
Yeah.
An author from an elite school is seen as more credible.
Absolutely. The institutional prestige penalty was stark. Papers from low prestige affiliations faced a clear penalty, a 7.5% relative increase in rejection recommendations. And this was despite getting nearly identical quality scores. They also tended to get slightly more critical reviewer comments, an added hurdle.
Which implies that the reputation of the institution becomes part of the judgment of the science, even when the LLM is supposed to be evaluating only the text. Was this bias the same across all disciplines?
No, interestingly, the low prestige penalty was most pronounced in the biological sciences. In that field, low-prestige authors got significantly lower quality scores and faced the highest rejection probability.
Why biology specifically?
The hypothesis from the study is that biological research is often incredibly resource-intensive. It relies on institutional support, specialized labs, animal facilities, technical staff. So in that discipline, your affiliation is a much stronger proxy for your actual research capacity than it might be in, say, theoretical physics. And the LLM internalized that proxy relationship.
That's both fascinating and terrifying. The technology that's meant to improve objectivity is just amplifying our existing biases because it was trained on the output of those biases. And the final piece of this LLM audit shows this isn't just a surface thing. It's deeply rooted in the training data, the embedded priors.
This is probably the most worrying part for the future of AI in academia. The researchers ran another diagnostic, a synthetic CV generation exercise. They asked the LLM to generate professional CVs based on the randomized author identities, and the analysis confirmed that strong prestige-linked productivity priors were just encoded in the model's training data.
Meaning the LLM automatically assumes certain things about your career success based purely on where you work.
Exactly. High-prestige profiles were far more likely to be labeled as tenured by the LLM and assign dramatically higher numbers of publications and citations. Critically, these patterns exaggerated and, in some cases, even inverted real-world benchmarks. Tenure is actually more common at less research-intensive teaching schools, but the LLM heavily associated it with high research prestige, so the model effectively reinforces structural inequities at machine scale. The AI is just learning to be an efficient bigot, prioritizing the brand over the content.
The takeaway here is that the institutions aren't just letting status reign. They've built a structure that actively rewards it. Which brings us to part 4, the institutional mechanisms and the financial cartel of big science. We have to follow the money to understand why they behave this way.
The current state of academic science, particularly in the U.S., is inseparable from its financial history. After World War II, there was a profound shift. Small science, decentralized, often run by private individuals, was replaced by the federalization of academic science, the era of big science. This transition, driven by federal dollars, led to exponential growth in funding, from around $255 million in 1953 to over $75 billion by 2017.
That scale of funding transformed the university from a place of learning into a massive grant-driven engine. But the source material says this created a self-serving and self-perpetuating cartel. How does the money corrupt the academic purpose?
The corruption lies in the mechanism of federal research grants, specifically in the concept of indirect costs. When a scientist gets a federal grant, the budget is split into 2 parts. Direct cost money for equipment, supplies, researcher salaries, and indirect costs.
Okay, let's break down indirect costs, because this is where the system gets gamed. What are they?
Indirect costs are a budgetary surcharge, often 50% or more, that's applied as a percentage of the direct costs. This money is supposedly to compensate the university for overhead, maintaining buildings, paying the administration, running IT, library resources, and so on.
And where does that huge surcharge go?
Crucially, it goes directly to the university's central administration. The scientist who wrote the grant never sees or controls that part of the money. So if a scientist gets a $100,000 grant for direct costs, the university might tack on an extra $50,000 to $75,000 in indirect costs, all of which is discretionary money for the administration.
So if the federal government is spending, say, $40 billion on academic research grants, and the average indirect rate is 50%, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars going directly to university administrations, outside of researcher tuition.
Exactly. And this provides universities with a massive, guaranteed, and highly discretionary stream of revenue. So here's the core conflict. The institution's primary interest is maximizing this indirect cost revenue, which means the actual quality or topic of the science becomes almost irrelevant. As long as the grant is big and it gets secured, the scientist becomes a turnkey whose function is to unlock that funding spigot.
The incentive is completely reversed. The university's bottom line depends on the volume of grants, not the quality of discovery. And this has led to some notorious examples of outright corruption.
The source material cites the infamous Stanford scandal in the mid-90s as a prime example of this being abused. At the time, Stanford was charging nearly 75% in indirect costs. Federal auditors later discovered, well, some profound expenditures that had been charged to this indirect cost gusher.
We're talking about flowers, weddings, and a yacht, right?
We are. Expenditures charged to funds meant to support scientific infrastructure included flowers for the university president's office, expenses for an administrator's wedding, fine china, and yes, a portion of the operating expenses for the university yacht. The story about David in part 1 showed the ethical collapse of an individual. The Stanford story showed the ethical collapse of the institution.
How does the yacht relate to public health research? It shows the administration views these grants as a personal slush fund, taxpayer money intended for science.
And while tighter rules were put in place, the core mechanism remains, and transparency is still low. Surveys 2 decades later still show indirect cost rates from 47% to nearly 90%. This cartel structure means the university's priority is just maximizing this revenue, putting scientists under relentless pressure to generate ever more funding, often just to pay for ever-increasing administrative bloat.
This sounds like a financial system that's explicitly designed to encourage scientists to conform to whatever political or social narrative brings in the largest federal grants.
It absolutely is, and this leads us directly to ideology over inquiry. The financial system encourages scientists to enable political interests through what are often called moral panics, because these panics unlock lucrative, massive funding streams and consequently more indirect cost money for the administration.
Can you give a specific example of how that moral panic funding loop works?
Well, consider 2 areas from the source material: climate change activism and the perceived national STEM crisis. The National Science Foundation, the NSF, is an enthusiastic funder of climate change research. They spent $1.4 billion out of a $7.8 billion budget on it in 2018. This massive spending stream, driven by the urgency of a climate emergency, is actively supported by academics who shape their research programs and their political lobbying to tack into it.
And the result is that the science is transformed from disinterested inquiry into a tool of political activism, where skeptical or critical researchers just get starved of funding.
Exactly. There's no reward for skepticism if that skepticism could threaten the funding tap. And this same mechanism applies directly to the administrative trend of diversity and inclusion, or D&I, the D&I conformity mechanism.
We mentioned the ideological audits for junior faculty. How does the financial mechanism fund this trend?
The D&I agenda has been a major driver of administrative bloat, and it's often funded through research grants and those indirect costs. To get funding and tenure now, faculty often have to submit loyalty statements outlining their commitment to D&I aims. This is sometimes called the NSS Broader Impacts Criteria. This process systematically marginalizes anyone who insists on skepticism, effectively requiring a political profession of faith to even be considered for research money.
And the so-called STEM crisis used to justify massive funding for these D&I programs. It's often just a political patronage scheme.
Right. The source material notes that universities are often churning out STEM graduates in numbers far greater than the available jobs. The crisis has been an ongoing justification since the post-war era. It's a feedback loop that channels taxpayer money toward politically favored groups and research areas, generating maximum indirect cost money for the administration. When money is the motive, ideology follows close behind.
If the financial system rewards conformity and administrative interest over independent inquiry, then the inevitable consequence has to be the erosion of core academic values, freedom of inquiry itself.
It is a systematic degradation, and the consequences are stark, particularly with the rise of internal censorship. When the ecosystem is driven by financial and ideological conformity, internal policing is inevitable. A comprehensive study analyzed sanction attempts, punitive measures, termination, forced resignation against academics over the last 23 years, and the trend is worrying. The total number of sanction attempts exceeded the total reported during the McCarthy era.
That is a staggering and chilling comparison. The suppression during McCarthyism was external policymakers pushing accusations onto academics. Where are these current greater threats coming from?
The origin has flipped entirely. During the McCarthy era, most suppression attempts came from external politicians. Today, the vast majority of attempts to suppress academic freedoms originate from within the college or university itself.
And who are the primary internal censors driving this?
The data is clear. Internal sanction attempts, nearly 1,000 over the 23-year period studied, originate mostly from undergraduate students, administrators, and other faculty members. Undergraduate students were the source of the highest number of attempts, and some reports note that over half of undergraduate students surveyed actually support policies that restrict speech, and a concerning number even find violence acceptable to suppress viewpoints they oppose.
Which suggests the institutional environment itself has socialized students into an ideological homogeny, where differing ideas are something to be policed and neutralized, not debated.
Exactly. The atmosphere encourages a culture where academic freedom is seen as a threat to ideological comfort. The consequence is that faculty members, seeing the high rate of disciplinary sanctions, 2/3 of all attempts resulted in some kind of sanction, are increasingly choosing to self-censor. They limit their own speech and stay silent on controversial topics because they're afraid of the career impacts. Whether it's a faculty member vilified for expressing discontent on social media or a biology professor fired because their coursework offended a political group, the message is the same. Conformity is mandatory, and termination happens in about 21% of these attempts.
The ultimate takeaway from this deep dive is that the academic world is navigating a crisis of methodology and integrity at every single level. It starts with the celebrated individual whose status gives them immunity from scrutiny, and it flows right down to the systemic machinery that funds and polices academic thought. We see failure in the individual, failure in peer review, and failure in the financial structure.
Indeed. We started with the question of why status shields bad science, and the answer is manifold. The Emeritus shield prioritizes prestige over rigor. Nobel disease confuses domain expertise with omnicompetence. Institutions fail to differentiate between being wrong, which is healthy, and being structurally unscientific, which is methodology abandoned. And the entire big science cartel is driven by a perverse financial mechanism that rewards political conformity and moral panics over creative, independent inquiry.
The core issue, then, remains methodology. Rigor demands constant scrutiny of all ideas, regardless of who says them or where they say them. It's the defining value of science.
And that is the path to institutional recovery. It requires uncompromising rigor against all forms of pseudoscience and systemic bias, whether that bias is ideological, financial, or algorithmic. Politeness and prestige must be abandoned in favor of empirical accountability, and the flow of money has to be divorced from these administrative ideological mandates. Otherwise, the academy will just continue to function as a hierarchy of convenience, protecting its brands and revenues while the pursuit of truth suffers in silence.